Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with Dr. Birx.
Do you think the president was just distracted by the political implications in the campaign?
You know, I always wonder that. And I mean, the worst possible time you can have a pandemic is in a presidential election year. I think the White House personnel were very focused on this pandemic in March and April. I think once the country began to open, and it was clear to me that they weren't going to follow my really gated criteria that I had worked hard on.
How to open restaurants, how to let people dine indoors.
I combined all of that together for these great gating criteria. So in calculating everything with the slow reopening, I didn't think anyone could get to phase 3 until August. And you can see in the states that followed either that criteria or a similar criteria, that's how long it took them.
Were there COVID deniers in the White House?
There are people in the White House, and I think people around this country, because I've had the privilege to meet them and listen to them and hear them, because I wanted to hear what people were saying. There were people who definitely believed that this was a hoax.
Why?
I think because the information was confusing at the beginning. I think because we didn't talk about the spectrum of disease, because everyone interpreted on what they knew. And so they saw people get COVID and be fine.
So you don't blame the president's own language of calling some of this politically motivated a hoax? It was a phrase he used at one point.
When you have a pandemic where you're relying on every American to change their behavior, communication is absolutely key. And so every time a statement was made by a political leader that wasn't consistent with public health needs, that derailed our response. It is also why I went out on the road, because I wasn't censored on the road.
You felt the White House was censoring you?
Well, if you've noticed, I was not able to do national press. The other thing that was very important to me is I was not going to go outside of the chain of command. And so if our White House comms group did not put me out, I didn't ask to go out. Because there was so much leaking and so many parallel stories being leaked to the press that did not have grounding in truth, that I didn't want to ever be part of that slippery slope. I know people started it with good intentions of trying to inform the American people, but then it became a way that they could silence those who didn't agree with them. And so I knew that every time I had a significant disagreement in the White House, that within days a story would be planted.
Who was doing that?
I think a lot of people were doing that.
Do you think the administration was suppressing vital information to win the election?
I don't know what their motivation was. I know that I was so frustrated that I realized that the only way, if I could not get a voice internally, that I could get a voice out at the state level. Because I could see the governors on the governor's call weekly, and I could see how deeply they were concerned about every one of their citizens. Most of them were not in the middle of an election campaign. I want to make it clear, this was just not Debbie Birx. There was a coalition of 4 of us at the beginning, from Steve Hahn to Bob Redfield to myself to Tony Fauci. We would make sure that we could get the information out to the public in one way or the other. It's why I sent the information to all of them every morning, because I never knew who would have the ability to do press.
Did you ever consider quitting?
Always. I mean, why would you want to put yourself through that every day? Colleagues of mine that I'd known for decades, in that one experience, because I was in the White House, decided that I had become this political person, even though they had known me forever. I had to ask myself every morning, is there something that I think I can do that would be helpful in responding to this pandemic? And it's something I ask myself every night. And when it became a point where I wasn't getting anywhere, and that was like right before the election. I wrote a very detailed communication plan of what needed to happen the day after the election, and how that needed to be executed. And there was a lot of promise that that would happen.
Because you knew at that point that the election was a factor in communication about the virus.
Yes. Yes.
Did you ever withhold information yourself?
No.
Some people felt you became an apologist for President Trump. They look at that moment in the briefing room.
Then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
You were sitting there and he looked at you and he asked about ultraviolet light and heat.
See?
And you start talking about fevers. You
No,
didn't
see,
say
this is the no.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that, the heat and the light relative to certain viruses, yes, but relative to this virus?
Not as a treatment. He was not speaking to me. He was speaking to the DHS scientist that was 2 seats over from me that entire time. When he finally turned to me and said, could this be a treatment? I said, not a treatment. You can look at the transcripts, not a treatment. But that moment was completely lost. And then there's, skits on Saturday Night Live.
We all mess up sometimes. You threw the ball wrong. I didn't say don't drink the bleach. It happens.
When you're a scientist who's grounded themselves in data and combating epidemics and working with communities and working with governments to change the future of people's lives for the better, and then you get, this is when you talked about, was I prepared for that? No, I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't even know what to do in that moment.
Sometimes people say, well, Tony Fauci, when that happened to him, he would sort of gently come back up to the podium and set the record straight.
Well, he was given the opportunity to do that.
And you don't feel you were given the opportunity to respond?
Not until he turned to me and said, could this be a treatment? And I said, not a treatment. People then wanted to define you by the moment. And I understand, I understand how perceptions go. I understood that to go into the White House and try to support a comprehensive coronavirus response by utilizing the strength of the federal government would be a terminal event for my federal career, which is part of the reason why I didn't want to do it.
Terminal event.
Terminal event. I know that I wouldn't be allowed to really continue successfully within the federal government. You can't go into something that's that polarized and not believe that you won't be tainted by that experience or how people interpret you in that experience. So I knew that part of it. I didn't want that to happen.
And this will be the end of your federal career.
Yeah, I will need to retire probably within the next 4 to 6 weeks from CDC.
And how have you made peace with that this pandemic, that you're leaving in the midst of this, that you will be associated with it?
What was reassuring to me all along is I knew this would be studied. I knew that the emails, the reports that I wrote, the request to expand testing, the how to improve therapeutics, all of that would eventually come to light. Maybe not in my lifetime.
You feel you'll be vindicated?
I'm not looking to be vindicated. In that moment, I think my service was important. I think it was important to make progress in testing. I think it was important in making progress with some of the therapeutics, and I think it was important to really, we had great innovation in vaccines. I was focused solely on the mission, and the mission was to try to save as many American lives during this pandemic as possible. And so I couldn't get distracted on vindicating myself or getting the information or telling coming back to the press and saying, that's not what happened. That would waste my energy in that moment of staying focused completely on that data and ensuring that I was seeing everything that was going on.
Yeah, I read a Washington Post profile of you, and it said, when she's working on a vital public health issue, Birx will do whatever is necessary as long as she thinks she can make a difference.
True. And it hurt my family. You know, all of this. I have 2 daughters in their 30s who had to live through this and watch their mother, these things said about their mother, to become a skit. I mean, I have 2 grandchildren, daughters. You know, I think I felt the whole time that I also had to be serious to be taken seriously. And I couldn't ever let emotion come into this. That no matter how frustrated I got, no matter how beaten down I got, I had to keep pushing as hard as I could. This tested my resilience because it tested my family. And the things that were said that were so untrue, all of that about Thanksgiving.
You were accused of gathering with people outside your household because you went to a beach house with them.
There was no one outside of my household. I have one household. We happened to live between 2 houses because I had to protect them from me when I was out on the road. When I came back, I quarantined. But if I had an emergency at that house, I wore a mask the whole time because I had to protect that household at all costs. I have a 92-year-old mother and a 96-year-old father and a daughter that's 38 weeks pregnant. And so the implication that I wouldn't follow CDC guidance, I followed CDC guidance, and that's what protected me. I mean, I was on the road for 6.5 months. I was in the White House during one of the hottest hotspots of viral transmission. And I remained negative because I followed the CDC guidelines. That's why I know they work, and that's why I take it very seriously.
Well, this summer, you gave an interview.
What we're seeing today is different from March and April. It is extraordinarily widespread.
And then President Trump tweeted. He blasted you for saying that. Did you ever speak to him after that?
I hadn't seen him for months before that or months after that. But that was
You're the coordinator of the COVID task force.
That was an extraordinary moment because I also got yelled at by the speaker, who I have tremendous, I mean, obviously, women
Speaker
have
Pelosi.
gone through a lot to get in their positions. I have tremendous respect for women and women leadership.
The Speaker Pelosi said she didn't have confidence in you because you were working for President Trump.
I don't have confidence in anyone who stands there while the president says, swallow Lysol and it's going to cure your virus. You know, it'll kill you and you won't have the virus anymore.
And so that was very hard because I've known her from the HIV world. And I have tremendous respect for what she brought early on. So in my mind, she's a political hero for what she has done in HIV, which, you know, I've spent a lifetime on along
So
with
that stung.
TB. Oh, that was hard. But she's not the only one. I think she gave voice to what a lot of people were thinking of how could you. I think they looked at going into the White House as somehow supporting a political party or a political individual. There are technical people that are brought in for their technical expertise.
But you often were perceived as explaining some of the things President Trump said rather than correcting him.
Well, when people ask me a question, I feel like I have to respond with what my perception of that moment was.
When we come back, Dr. Birx talks about masks, or the lack thereof, in the White House. We want to pick back up with Dr. Birx, talking about the moment last spring when she and the task force realized they had a serious problem.
Everyone knew that. Everyone knew that from, I would say, March 8th on. Because you only had to look at the slopes of the curves in these major metropolitan cities to understand what was happening, and understanding, if you're seeing that rate of hospitalization, how much community spread there was.
But you were trying to get Americans just to wear masks. And the president himself was undermining you. He wasn't wearing one. Is there ever a way to make that scenario work?
Well, you have to, because that's the president. So you have to figure out how to get that message out when you can't get it out from the head of the country. And that's our job. You don't give up. You can't ever, in any moment when American lives are at stake, say, well, this is just too hard, I'm giving up.
But where's the vice president in all of this?
The vice president knew what I was doing.
You mean he knew that you were telling the governors privately to do things that the president publicly was making light of when he was saying you don't really need to wear a mask, or pushing to reopen the economy faster than your guidelines would allow? Mike Pence knew that.
He knew what I was doing.
And he supported
Because
it?
I'm not a person who would go out on their own and not do, I wouldn't go.
Well, why would you have to be sneaking around? You're the head of the COVID task force, and tens of thousands of Americans are dying. Why is that a covert operation?
Because if this isn't working and you're not going to get that to work, you have to find another solution.
Leaving it up to the states, is that the way it should be in a pandemic, is the fundamental question.
Yes.
Tell me about some of the resistance from governors, because you're going out there and you're telling them to wear a mask, to limit indoor dining. And for some of these Republican governors, that would mean going against the head of their party to do what you're telling them to do.
I don't know if that was as much as the dynamic as they were dealing with Republican legislatures and legislators. You needed every single level of government then to work together to ensure that, again, we're talking about behavioral change of American citizens.
How much responsibility lies on the shoulders of the governors running these states?
A lot. A lot. We have to be consistent. Sturgis was not okay. Birthday parties, not okay. Bringing together family members indoors, maskless. None of this, we have to be very clear to the community. And yes, we're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We're human. If you made a mistake, if you had a gathering, at least get tested, wear a mask around those vulnerable. Assume you got exposed and are infected, and wear a mask around those vulnerable.
But how did the task force allow the president, who calls himself a germaphobe, to get COVID himself? How did that happen?
There were only 2 people who regularly wore a mask in the White House. Myself and Tyler Ann McGuffrey, the support person that I had from HHS.
So the staff around the president was not wearing a mask. He's the commander-in-chief. This is a national security risk. How is that possible?
I think people believed, wrongly, that testing would be adequate.
How is that possible?
I think they believed that testing is a surrogate for a public health intervention.
But did you say the president of the United States needs to wear a mask? Did you press Mike Pence on that? Did you press Mark Meadows, his chief of staff?
There are multiple communications about masking. Remember when I was talking about the stream of data coming in? They were mixing data that didn't have anything to do with the relevance of masking as a public health measure to changing into masking as a personal protective measure.
But did you ever say, you're misunderstanding this, you need to wear a mask, these are close quarters and you're way too close to the President of the United States? You're nodding yes. You had that argument.
Not with the president. I mean, I didn't have that kind of access, but to certainly people around the president, yes.
And they just didn't take it seriously?
I just want to make it clear, people were concerned about the president and wanted to protect the president. They believed that testing would be a reasonable substitution for people masking.
How sick did the president actually get?
I don't know. I don't know.
Did anyone ever say this is a national security risk and we need to nail down who brought this in and who infected the commander-in-chief?
I never heard those conversations.
There was no serious contact tracing that happened after the fact?
I don't know if there was contact tracing or not.
What was your biggest mistake?
I always feel like I could have done more, been more outspoken, maybe been more outspoken publicly. I didn't know all the consequences of all of these issues. When you're put into a new situation and you only know one person in the White House, and you don't understand the culture of the White House, it's very difficult to get your footing. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying I didn't know how far I could push the envelope.
You wish you pushed harder.
Yes.
We spent nearly 90 minutes talking to Dr. Birx. We'd been tested and we were seated 10 feet apart in a well-ventilated facility. An extended version is available through our digital network and in a special edition of our new podcast, Facing Forward. We want to check in with senior foreign correspondent Liz Palmer in London.
Good morning. Here's a sobering statistic. Although the number of infections is at last coming down here, England now has the worst per capita coronavirus death rate in the world. Gravediggers in North London were hard at work this week, making more room. Hospitals are full of people sick with the so-called UK mutation, which new data suggests does kill more people. Stark public warnings like this one reinforce the national lockdown.
Look them in the eyes and tell them you're doing all you can to stop the spread of COVID-19.
But there's good news here, too. Britain's vaccine rollout is the third fastest in the world, about to hit the 6 million mark. Europe, by contrast, is having a rough time. Vaccinations there got off to a slow start, and now supplies are running low thanks to manufacturing problems. So lockdowns in some places are getting stricter. The Netherlands has imposed a curfew for the first time since the Second World War, though dog walkers are exempt. The fastest vaccine rollout is in Israel. It started with the elderly, but now even teenagers are getting their COVID shots. And finally, there was huge international relief this week when the U.S. rejoined the World Health Organization, where it will add real muscle to the efforts to get vaccine to the developing world. Margaret?
We'll be right back. We'll be talking to Dr. Scott Gottlieb later today. You can see it on our website or listen through our Facing Forward podcast. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.